Alice Draymore hadn't planned to return to Hollow Road, much less to the old farmhouse that loomed at the edge of the woods like a relic no one dared disturb. Her grandmother's death had been sudden, a stroke in her sleep, they said, but not entirely unexpected. Still, the weight of inheritance fell heavy on Alice, especially now. The divorce had left her unmoored. Jason was gone. The apartment in Seattle gone. The savings divided. She needed quiet, needed to disappear. And so she packed what little she had left into the back of a weathered Subaru and made the long drive to Vermont, up winding roads choked with leafless trees, past towns too small for names on maps. Eventually, she arrived at the end of Hollow Road, where fog drifted in permanent currents through the trees and no neighbors could be seen for miles. The farmhouse had sat untouched for years, even when her grandmother was alive. Agnes Draymore had always lived strangely, reclusive, some said, keeping to herself, muttering odd phrases at night when Alice was young and came to visit. There were stories in town, whispered ones. That Agnes spoke to things in the walls, that animals avoided the house. That sometimes in the early morning mist, people saw shadows move between the windows upstairs, even when she was the only one home. Alice laughed at those stories back then. Now, alone with only the wind for company, they seemed less funny. The house itself was ancient, probably built in the 1880s, all groaning beams and peeling wallpaper. The wraparound porch sagged in places. The weather vane was shaped like a crow, rusted and spinning wildly in the wind. Inside, it smelled like old cedar, liniment, and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. The furniture had been covered with white sheets, which Alice tore away one by one, sending up clouds of dust that made her eyes water. The fireplace still had the ashes of the last fire her grandmother had lit, probably months ago. She swept it out, lit candles in the dark, and tried to pretend it was just a house. But there was something about the silence here. Not peaceful, watchful. She explored slowly, careful not to disturb too much. The second floor was off-limits in her mind. She couldn't explain why, only that the thought of opening those doors made her skin tighten. The attic was bolted shut. The basement, well, that was locked too and had always been. Even as a child, she remembered her grandmother's warning. Don't go down there, ever. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. Alice unpacked, set up her old laptop on the dining table, and watched downloaded shows to avoid thinking. She opened the windows during the day and let the cold air in, though it never seemed to fully dispel the heaviness of the place. But on the 3rd night, something changed. She woke at precisely 3:12 a.m. The clock on the wall ticked once loudly, then stopped. Then came the knock. 3 of them, sharp, measured, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Alice sat bolt upright in bed. The sound had come from the front door. She waited, maybe it was wind, a branch, her imagination. Another minute passed, nothing. She got out of bed slowly, pulled on a sweater and crept down the creaking stairs, each step protesting beneath her. The front hall was dark. She hadn't left any lights on. The windows showed only thick fog pressing against the glass like a living thing. She stood before the front door. Her hand hovered near the knob. "Hello," she called. No answer, just the wind sighing through the eaves. With a deep breath, she unlocked and opened the door. The porch was empty. Nothing but cold air and darkness. No footprints on the wooden steps. No signs of movement, just fog and silence. She waited there a moment longer, then closed the door, bolting it again. She chalked it up to stress, to an overactive mind frayed by exhaustion. But as she turned back toward the stairs, she noticed something strange. A trail of water. Just 3 small droplets, spaced evenly on the wood floor. As though something, or someone, had stood right outside the door and had been dripping. The droplets were dark in the weak moonlight, perfectly round and spaced like footprints that stopped just shy of the welcome mat. Alice crouched down, reached a hesitant finger toward the nearest one, and touched it. Cold, not quite water, thicker, almost syrupy. She wiped her hand on her sweater with a frown and tried not to let her mind run wild. Maybe the condensation from the fog had pooled somehow. Or maybe the porch roof was leaking. That would explain it. It had to. She cleaned the droplets with an old dish towel and went back upstairs, refusing to look at the clock as she passed it. But her eyes couldn't help it. 3:14 a.m. She barely slept. Each creak of the house stretched her nerves thinner. When the first weak rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. That morning, Alice made coffee that tasted like metal and stale wood. She wandered the house, trying to keep busy. She opened windows, even swept the kitchen floor, trying to pretend the night before had been a dream. But she kept returning to the front door, staring at it like it owed her an explanation. There was no sign of the droplets now. The floor was dry. Still, something gnawed at her. So, around noon, she decided to do something she hadn't done since moving in. She went into the basement. The key had hung for years from a little rusted hook near the pantry. She had always assumed it belonged to an old chest or maybe the attic. But now she tested it on the basement door at the end of the hallway, and it turned smoothly. The smell hit her first. Dampness, old rot, not quite mold, but the hint of decay that had sunk into the wooden stairs and never left. She clicked on the light. A single bulb on a long pull chain flickered, casting uncertain shadows down the narrow steps. "Just storage," she whispered to herself, but her voice didn't sound convincing or welcome. She stepped down slowly. The wood moaned beneath her feet. Boxes lined the walls, sealed and yellowed. She saw old furniture draped in sheets, a coat rack, a rusted tricycle, a cracked mirror leaning face down against the wall. Nothing unusual. But there was a spot near the back wall, an area where the concrete was darker, like it had been damp recently. The air there felt cooler, still. She moved closer. A faint shape had been scrawled on the floor, mostly rubbed away by time, but faint lines remained. A rough circle, something like a symbol inside it, something not quite natural. She didn't recognize it, but it gave her a shiver that settled between her shoulder blades. Alice backed away slowly and shut the door behind her. She locked it. That night, she fell asleep with every light on, just in case. 3:12 a.m. She woke again. Like before, her eyes snapped open at the exact minute. The house was still. Too still. Even the wind had quieted. She didn't want to look at the door. But the knock came anyway. Knock, knock, knock. The exact same cadence. Alice froze. She reached for her phone. Dead. Battery completely drained, though it had been nearly full when she'd gone to sleep. The knocking didn't come again. Not a second set. Not a pause. Just those 3 patient knocks. This time, she didn't go downstairs. She waited. Sat there in bed, gripping the edge of the sheets like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. Then she heard it. Footsteps, not loud, just soft creaks along the floorboards below, walking slowly across the living room, toward the kitchen, then back. She couldn't move. Her chest felt too tight, like something was sitting on her lungs. Her ears strained. The footsteps stopped beneath her room. She imagined someone, or something, standing directly below her. Looking up. Waiting. Eventually, it moved away. The sound drifted toward the hallway. And then, the faint rattle of the basement door handle. It jiggled once, twice, a pause, then 3 distinct turns like someone testing the lock. But it held. She didn't sleep again. In the morning, the door was still locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. But the trail was back. Not at the front door this time. This time, the droplets led from the basement door to the center of the hallway, and then stopped. As though whatever had left them had simply vanished into the floor. Alice stayed up the next night. No candles, no cozy blankets, no distractions. Just her, a single lamp in the corner of the living room, and a thermos of coffee she kept refilling from the stove. She didn't want to be surprised this time. If the knocks came again, she would be ready. She tried to rationalize it during the day. Sleepwalking, oral hallucinations, grief making her hear things. Maybe she'd seen a squirrel or raccoon dragging something wet across the floor. Basements always sounded creepy. Right. But nothing about it felt like misperception. Nothing explained the cold droplets. Nothing explained the footsteps. And definitely nothing explained why, when she tried to draw the strange circle from the basement on paper, her hand shook and wouldn't cooperate. Like her body didn't want her to copy it. Like it knew. That night, she sat in the dark, watching the hallway leading to the front door, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. She checked the time obsessively. 2:57 a.m. The minutes dragged. 3 o'clock. She counted slowly in her head. The wind had returned, brushing the walls like hands across fabric. The house creaked softly in protest. Somewhere, a pipe gurgled in the walls. Her breath fogged slightly in the cold. 3:11 a.m. She stood up, stepped forward. 3:12 a.m. Nothing. Silence. She held her breath. No knock came. Her chest loosened slightly. Maybe it really had been a dream. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet, and she exhaled a laugh of relief. "Thank God," she whispered. Then, knock, knock, knock. She jumped. The sound didn't come from the front door. It came from behind her. The basement door. Her mouth went dry. The knock hadn't changed. Same pattern, same deliberate rhythm, but now it was inside. She turned slowly toward the hallway. 3 droplets glistened on the hardwood, leading again from the base of the basement door, trailing toward her feet. Drip, drip, drip. A 4th drop fell as she stared. She couldn't tell where it had come from. It was just there, like the house was bleeding. The air felt charged, pressurized. She could feel the hairs on her arms standing upright. Her ears popped faintly. It was the same sensation she felt right before a thunderstorm as a child. Something was close. She didn't open the door. She didn't speak. She just turned, walked calmly to the kitchen, and locked herself inside with a butcher knife from the drawer. She didn't sleep that night either. She didn't even blink for long stretches, afraid that something might change if she took her eyes off the hallway for too long. In the morning, the droplets were gone again. The trail ended at her living room rug. And when she checked her phone, she found an unread text. No numbers. Just a timestamp, 3:12 a.m. The message simply said, "You heard me." That day, Alice did what any reasonable person would do. She packed a bag. She called a motel 3 towns over and booked a room for the week. She left a note on the table in case anyone came by, though who would, she didn't know. She locked every door, every window. Then she drove. As she pulled out of the gravel driveway, she swore she saw a shape in the upstairs window. It might have been her imagination. It might have been a shadow, but it wasn't her. She didn't look again. The motel was dingy but blessedly normal. Beige walls, old carpets, neon vacancy sign outside flickering slightly. She checked in, took a long shower, and fell into bed. She slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, it was mid-afternoon. Sunlight poured through the blinds. The world felt solid again. Then she saw her phone blinking. Another message. Same number, unknown. Running won't help. She dropped the phone. Her mouth went dry again. She turned off the device, pulled the battery for good measure, and tossed it in the dresser drawer. She didn't return to the house that day. But that night, around 3 a.m., she heard knocking. Not from the door. Not from the wall. From beneath her. 3 knocks. Even here, it had followed her. Alice left the motel the next morning under a sky smeared with low-hanging clouds. The light felt wrong. Too pale, too weak, like the sun had dimmed just for her. Despite every instinct telling her to keep driving, to leave Hollow Road behind, something pulled at her. She didn't want to go back. But she had to know. The road twisted like a vein through the woods. Trees pressed in closer than she remembered. Bare branches arched above the road like ribs. It felt like she was being swallowed whole. The farmhouse appeared suddenly through the mist, just as it always did, stoic, worn, and silent. No signs of intrusion, no footprints on the porch, but she knew something was waiting. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The kitchen light flickered once and went out. The first thing she did was check the basement door. Still locked, still dry. But the old rug in the hallway had been pulled slightly askew. She hadn't left it that way. There was something new too, a smell, like burning hair and damp earth. It clung to her clothes the moment she stepped into the living room. She followed the smell. It led to the den, her grandmother's favorite room. A musty, narrow space filled with old books and faded velvet chairs. The shelves were still thick with dust, but one book had been disturbed. A large, leather-bound volume that looked more like a family Bible than anything else. But it wasn't a Bible. There was no title on the spine, no publisher's mark. The cover was smooth and cold to the touch, almost slick. She opened it with hesitation. Inside were pages filled with tight, precise handwriting, her grandmother's. It wasn't a diary. It was more like a record. February 11, 1974, the knocking began again. 3, always 3. I burned the sage, but it came anyway. I heard it in the cellar. It called my name this time. Alice's fingers trembled as she flipped through more entries. March 2, 1983, the circle held, but it's weakening. It watches me now. The mirrors show it clearest. August 9, 1991. I should have never opened the door that third time. There were symbols scrawled in the margins. That same circle she'd seen in the basement appeared over and over, along with variations she didn't understand. Spirals, intersecting triangles, words in languages she couldn't read. Alice dropped the book and stumbled back. Her grandmother had known. She'd been haunted too, for decades, and she had written it all down, hidden it in this room like a confession no one would ever read. Alice sat on the edge of the chair, pressing her palms against her eyes. She wasn't imagining things. This was real. The book said it came in 3s, 3 knocks, 3 visits, and then something changed. A page near the end caught her attention. It was torn, smudged with what looked like ash, but she could still read the last few lines. It chooses a time, 3:12. That's when the veil is weakest. That's when it can be heard. The first knock is the warning. The second is the invitation. The third. The rest was missing. Alice closed the book with shaking hands. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep upstairs. She dragged a blanket onto the couch in the den and left the lamp on. She set her phone to record audio, laid it on the coffee table, and stared at the clock. 3:12 a.m. Silence. Then the knock. But not 3 this time. Just 1. Knock. A pause. Then the second. Knock. And then nothing. No third. Just a low hiss in the air. Not quite a voice, but close, almost like someone whispering in her ear. She couldn't make out the words. They were just outside the edge of understanding. But something in her blood reacted, her heart pounding with recognition her mind couldn't place. And then it was gone. She listened to the recording the next morning. The knocks were there, clear and loud. But something else was too. A voice, faint but present. She played it over and over. It said her name. Alice. Alice didn't leave the house again. Not that day, not the one after. Something had changed the moment she read that book, like a door had opened not just in the house, but inside her. The whispers hadn't stopped. They weren't constant and they weren't loud, but they were always present now. If she stood still, if the world went quiet for long enough, she could hear them. Breathing through walls, pressing against the floorboards, nestled in the hum of dead air like larvae in rotting fruit. And every night at 3:12 a.m., the knocking resumed. But never in the same place. Sometimes the front door. Sometimes the basement. Once, she swore she heard it coming from inside the wall behind her headboard. That time, she didn't sleep for 3 days. By the end of the week, her eyes were bloodshot, and her voice had gone hoarse from whispering to herself to fill the silence. She scrawled the symbol from the basement in charcoal on every door, every window, like her grandmother had once done. She even painted a version in salt on the floor around her bed. But none of it stopped the knocking. On the 8th night, something changed again. There was no knock, no whisper, no sound at all. The house was dead, and that terrified her more than anything. She walked the halls in complete silence, her ears aching with the absence of creaks, drips, groans, anything. The walls seemed to inhale, and the floor no longer protested her steps. Even the wind had stilled outside. It was as though the house had paused, waiting for something to arrive. That's when she found the door. It wasn't supposed to be there. A small door, maybe 5 feet high, set into the wall behind a dusty bookcase in her grandmother's study. She only discovered it after knocking over the shelf in frustration. The frame had been sealed with nails, rusted and ancient, hammered in at strange angles. The edges of the door were blackened, like they'd been burned. There was no knob, just an old iron ring embedded in the center. And carved above it, so faint she nearly missed it, were 3 words. Let him in. She didn't touch it. Not at first. She just stared at it for a long time, her fingers curling and uncurling. The air in front of it was warmer. The silence around it was heavier, like a sound vacuum pulling in breath, thought, reason. Alice stumbled back. She tried to rationalize this was part of the house, right? A servant's door, maybe, some forgotten closet. But even her thoughts sounded hollow inside her own skull. This door wasn't part of the house. It was part of something else. That night, she didn't go to bed. She sat in front of the strange door, watching it like it might move on its own. The audio recorder was on again, balanced on the floor beside her. She whispered questions into the darkness, hoping for silence. Instead, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the recorder picked up a voice. It didn't sound like a whisper this time. It sounded like someone standing right behind the microphone. Open it. She didn't sleep. She didn't move. The next morning, Alice finally went back down to the basement, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The dreams had returned. She saw the circle again, but this time it wasn't worn. It glowed red-hot, pulsing like a heartbeat. In the dream, she stood in the center. Someone, something, stood just outside it, pressing against an invisible wall. And it knew her name. Back in the real basement, Alice cleared the debris away from the back wall. The circle was still there, faint and broken in places, but unmistakable. She dropped to her knees and began tracing it in chalk, matching it perfectly to the version in her grandmother's book. It felt wrong to do, but worse not to. Once the circle was whole again, she sat inside it. Nothing happened. But that night, she heard footsteps upstairs, heavy ones, and a voice, not whispering, calling, Alice. She turned her head toward the ceiling. And then she heard the door. The unseen door opened slowly above her. Alice didn't move for a long time. She sat in the chalk circle in the basement, staring up at the ceiling as the footsteps passed over her like slow, dragging thunder. Her breath made little clouds in the air, and her skin prickled with the awareness that something was no longer just near, but inside. The door above her, the one hidden behind the bookcase, had opened. She hadn't seen it happen, but she knew. She felt it in her bones. And she felt, more than anything, that it had been her fault. That morning, when the light filtered through the dusty cellar window, Alice climbed back upstairs. The air in the house was no longer still. It moved now, shifting and breathing in currents that touched the back of her neck even when the windows were shut. The hidden door stood wide open. It led to a narrow corridor, cramped and wrong. Not like a hallway someone had built, but like a tunnel carved into the bones of the house. The walls were made of warped wood and blackened stone, and the ceiling sloped just enough to make her duck. The air was humid and smelled of rust and mildew. At the end of the hall was a single room. It was small, bare. The walls were covered in scratches, some names, some symbols, many of them repeating over and over in wild, erratic strokes. In the center sat an old rocking chair. It faced the wall. And on the wall were dozens of mirrors. Each one cracked, each one stained. Some tiny like makeup compacts, others tall and warped like carnival glass. They were arranged in a circle, facing the chair, facing whoever sat in it. Alice stepped forward. The mirrors did not reflect the room. They showed other things. In one, she saw the basement, except the circle was glowing, and something was pacing just beyond its border. In another, she saw herself, standing in the kitchen, except she wasn't moving, and her eyes were pitch black. In a third, she saw Agnes Draymore, younger but unmistakable, sitting in that same chair, murmuring something, rocking back and forth. Alice backed out of the room quickly, but the image of Agnes lingered in her mind, not just from the mirror, from her memories. Something clicked, a recollection, dusty and half-buried. She was 9, visiting for the summer. She'd woken in the night to find Agnes gone from her bed. She'd crept downstairs and followed a dim light into the study. She hadn't opened the door, but she'd heard something. A whispering voice, her grandmother answering back, and 3 distinct knocks. She'd blocked it out, rewritten it as a dream, but it hadn't been. Agnes had spoken to it. That night, Alice went back to the leather-bound book. She began reading deeper, tracing every entry, every date, every terrified note in the margins. The thing had been with Agnes for years. It came to her mother first, Alice's great-grandmother, when she was young. The entries described it as the man outside, though it wasn't always a man. It changed, adapted, wore faces like a coat. The book hinted at its rules. It came at a specific time, 3:12 a.m. That was when the barrier was weakest. The first knock was a warning. The second, an invitation. The third let it in. But the entity couldn't just barge in, not completely. It needed someone to recognize it, to remember. That's how it persisted. That's how it grew. And Agnes had kept it at bay, through ritual, through silence, through secrecy. She had never let it knock 3 times. Until the night she died. There was a final, frantic entry. I am tired. I cannot keep it out much longer. I fear what will happen when I'm gone. She must not return here. She must forget. Alice realized she was the she. Agnes had tried to protect her by keeping her away. But the moment Alice stepped back into the house, it began again. The man outside had been waiting. Not just for any door. For her. That night, she heard the 3rd knock again. Not at the door. Not at the basement. But on the mirror in her grandmother's room. She saw the reflection move before the sound came. Her reflection didn't blink, didn't breathe. And when the knock came sharp and direct, It didn't echo in the air. It echoed inside her head. Knock. 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 Her reflection smiled. The knock echoed for minutes after it had ended. Not in the air, not through the house, but inside Alice, like a bell had rung in the center of her chest and left something cracked behind. Her reflection still stared at her, motionless, her expression stretched into something not quite human. The smile was just a little too wide, the eyes a little too deep. There was something about the angles of the face off by millimeters, but enough to feel it in her stomach. She should have looked away. Instead, she stepped forward. The mirror, the tall, narrow one in the corner of Agnes's bedroom, seemed taller than before. The glass no longer reflected the room around it. Instead, it showed darkness, depth, like a window into a place where light had never existed. She reached out, touched the glass, and her fingers passed through. No resistance, no temperature, like the surface of a still pond. She pulled back instinctively. Her fingers were cold, numb, tingling with the wrong kind of energy. But something behind the reflection stirred then, something inside the mirror. A shape, tall, slender, watching her from the other side. It didn't move, but she knew it was aware of her. Then her reflection blinked and whispered, "Come and see." She turned to run, but found herself standing in front of the mirror again, as though the house itself had folded inward, funneled her back. The doorway was gone. The walls were unfamiliar. Nothing about this space made architectural sense anymore. The mirror pulsed once. Alice stepped through. The world on the other side was quiet. Not silent. Quiet in the way a forest is quiet just before a predator strikes. The air was heavy, syrupy. There was no color here, only shades of charcoal and bleeding gray. Shapes drifted in the distance. Trees without leaves, homes without doors, rooms full of furniture but no walls. She stood on what looked like cracked tile, stretching in every direction like a spider web of porcelain bones. Above her, the sky boiled with ink. And in front of her stood the farmhouse. But not her farmhouse. This one sagged more, tilted unnaturally to one side. Windows glowed from within, not with light, but with awareness. The front door was open. Inside stood Agnes. At least, it looked like Agnes. She was younger, 30s maybe. Her hair was loose and her eyes were too black, too deep. Her smile was strained, like skin pulled too tightly over teeth. "Alice," she said softly, "you shouldn't have come." Alice's voice barely made it out. "What is this place?" Agnes turned and began walking into the house. Memory, echo, trap, it's all the same here. Alice hesitated, then followed. Inside, the house was a maze of wrongness. The stairs twisted upward into themselves. The halls stretched too far, filled with doors that opened into identical copies of the same room. A child's bedroom with a cracked window and a teddy bear with no eyes. They walked in silence. Agnes, or the thing wearing Agnes, moved like she knew the path. "I held it here," she said. "For a long time, decades. You have no idea what it cost. You let it in." Agnes didn't argue, she just nodded. Not the first time, but eventually, yes. You get tired, you get curious, it promises so much. "What is it?" The man outside. The third voice, the uninvited. It has names, but it's older than language. It waits for you to open the door, and when you do. She stopped walking. They had reached another mirror larger than the rest. It filled the entire wall. This one showed no reflection at all. Just a door. The same hidden door behind the bookcase. Agnes looked at her. "It doesn't want the house, it wants you." "Why meet?" "Because you still remember." She looked down, her voice breaking for the first time. "Because I left it hungry." Something moved behind the mirror. It wasn't a reflection. It was here, behind the glass, pressing close. Alice saw the outline of limbs, too long, too thin, and a head that bent in the wrong place. It scraped long fingers across the glass with a sound like a violin string breaking. Agnes stepped into the circle of light around the mirror. "Do not answer the third knock," she said. "Whatever happens." "I already did." Agnes turned and screamed. The mirror shattered, and from the shards, something stepped out. The sound of the mirror breaking wasn't like glass. It was deeper, wetter, like ice cracking across a frozen lake or bone being crushed under slow, deliberate pressure. Alice staggered back as shards rained down in slow motion, each piece catching the flickering gray light. They didn't fall to the floor. They hung in the air, suspended in a slow orbit around the frame. And from the fractured center stepped it. Not a man. Not a ghost. Not anything Alice could name. It was tall, its head brushing the angled ceiling of the knot house. Its limbs were disproportionate, joints bending in ways that screamed wrongness. Its skin, if that's what it was smooth and pale like porcelain left in a bog for centuries. Its face had too many eyes, but none of them looked straight at her. Instead, they blinked out of sync, focusing in different directions, like it was trying to understand what it was seeing. When it opened its mouth, it didn't speak. It knocked. Once, twice, then it paused, waiting for her to acknowledge the third. Agnes, the thing that had worn her grandmother's face, collapsed. Her body crumpled into ash, then scattered in the silent wind like dead leaves. No scream, no struggle. Gone. Alice stood alone in front of it. She couldn't move. Not because she was afraid, though she was, but because something deeper, older had taken hold. A weight in her stomach. A recognition. She had seen this thing before. Not just in dreams, not just in the distorted reflections of the farmhouse. In her childhood. It came back in a rush, being 5 years old, tucked into bed by Agnes. The sound of something tapping at the window. 3 slow knocks. Her grandmother whispering across the hallway. "Don't look, don't listen." And Alice peeking anyway. Just for a second. A shape outside the glass. Watching her. Smiling. It had never left. It had been waiting. All these years. Not to haunt her, but to be remembered. Because that was how it entered. That was how it grew. Memories. Repetition. Acknowledgement. Alice stumbled back, breath catching. The world around her flickered, walls dissolving into fog, floors cracking like old eggshell. The only stable thing was the entity, standing silent, its many eyes watching her collapse. It lifted a long, jointless hand and pointed to her chest, and she understood. It didn't want the house. It wanted a host, someone to invite it in, someone to carry it forward. The third knock wasn't about letting it in a house. It was about letting it in you. Alice screamed, loud and full of fury, and ran. Not toward a door, not toward the mirror, but deeper into the knot house, into the impossible hallways, the shifting memories, the walls made of broken time. Rooms unfolded around her. Her childhood bedroom, her grandmother's garden, the hospital room where her mother died. The entity followed slowly. It didn't chase. It knew. There was nowhere to run. This place was made of her. Every memory, every fear, every moment she ever flinched at a shadow or paused at a creaking stair. This realm, the in-between, it had been growing inside her since the first knock. She found herself back in the basement, but not the real one. The version that lived in this place. The circle glowed red under her feet. And the voice spoke again. Not from outside, not from the thing, from inside her own mind. "Say my name." She shook her head. "No." "Say it and it ends." She knew that voice now. It was her mother's. No, wearing her mother's voice. "Say it." A third knock rang out, not from outside, from inside her skull. And something behind her, something she couldn't see, reached out to touch her shoulder. The red circle beneath Alice's feet pulsed like a heartbeat, each glow tightening around her like a noose. The air in this fractured basement was thick, heavy, filled with whispers she couldn't understand but felt in every nerve ending. The entity's presence pressed on her chest, cold and weightless at once, demanding, "Say my name." The voice, her mother's, soft, coaxing, broken by something else, something wrong beneath the tenderness. It wasn't her mother, not really. It was the thing wearing her. Alice's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed no. But the third knock echoed relentlessly inside her head. Knock, knock, knock. Each strike forced the words closer, clawing their way out. A name she knew she'd never say, a name tied to all the fear, all the silence that had haunted her family for generations. The name Agnes. The name Draymar. The name bound to the darkness that had stalked them since before Alice's birth. Her mind scrambled. She wanted to scream, to run, to break through this nightmare, but the walls bent closer, the mirrors cracked and reformed, trapping her in the endless labyrinth of memories and shadows. "Say it," the voice insisted. Her hands clenched the cold floor, nails digging into the cracked tile. Say it meant release. Say it meant opening the door. But not saying it meant endless torment. Alice's lips quivered, a war raging inside. To speak was to surrender to the thing, to let it into her, but to remain silent was to be consumed by its hunger. A shadow flickered behind her, fingers brushing her shoulder, cold enough to freeze her bones. It wasn't just a touch, it was a promise. Then, in the stillness, a whisper unlike any other pierced through the darkness. "Remember who you are." It was a voice from inside herself, but clearer than ever before. Stronger. A memory flared, a moment when Agnes, her grandmother, had whispered to her in the old garden under the moonlight. "Fear the silence, Alice. Fear what waits behind the knock, but never forget you are the keeper of the door." Suddenly, the circle beneath her feet flared white-hot. The cracks in the mirrors glowed like veins. The oppressive air shifted, no longer just a prison, but a battlefield. Alice forced herself to stand, shaking, breath ragged but eyes clear. The entity's many eyes followed her every movement, but it no longer seemed certain. The power she'd inherited, the strength Agnes had passed down, was awakening inside her. The voice whispered one last time, "Say it." And she screamed, "Never." The circle shattered, splinters of light exploding outward. The entity recoiled, howling a sound like broken glass and distant thunder, before vanishing into the shattered reflections. Alice collapsed to the floor, trembling but free for now. The house creaked back to life, the silence broken. The third knock would come again. But she would be ready. The house was quiet in a way that wasn't empty. It was waiting, like a beast holding its breath before a hunt. Alice sat on the cracked basement floor, the echo of her scream still ringing in the cold air. She was exhausted, every muscle trembling, but something had shifted deep inside her. The weight on her chest was lighter. The oppressive fog that had clouded her mind was lifting. She was no longer just the frightened girl who had answered the knock. She was the keeper. She stood and faced the basement walls, now covered in glowing chalk symbols, ancient wards and seals drawn over generations, each one a tether holding back the darkness. The third knock would come again. It always did. And when it did, she would be ready. Alice took the worn, leather-bound book from her bag, flipping to the final page Agnes had written on, a passage scrawled in trembling ink. To keep the door closed is to remember the price, to bear the silence and carry the pain. The knock is a promise it waits for us to falter to forget, but we do not forget. We keep the oath. Her fingers traced the words. She whispered the oath aloud. I am the guardian of the threshold. I bind the dark with memory. I close the door with my will. I answer the knock, but never the third. The walls hummed softly, the basement alive with ancient power. The air shimmered with the echo of past keepers, Agnes, her mother, and the generations before. They were all here in this place. And so was the entity. The house groaned, a warning and a challenge. From the shadows, the many-eyed shape shimmered into view. It stepped forward, coalescing from mist and shadow into something almost human, but twisted, fractured, impossible. Its voice was a rasp, layered with every voice Alice had ever heard in her nightmares. You think you can stop me. You think the knock ends with you. I am the hunger that never sleeps, the silence behind the scream. I am the shadow in your blood, the curse on your name. Alice met its gaze. I am not afraid. The entity laughed, a sound like ice cracking and chains breaking. You carry my mark, you hold my memory. We are bound. Alice lifted the book. And I carry your prison. With a fierce cry, she began to recite the incantation Agnes had written, a litany of binding and banishment, a song of chains and silence. The room filled with light, not warm but cold and bright, a blinding glow that fractured the darkness into shards. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore through the house and beyond, then began to dissolve, retreating into shadow and silence. When the light faded, Alice was alone. The house was still, but the knocking had stopped. Outside, dawn broke over the hills. Alice stepped out of the front door, the book clutched tightly in her hands. She looked back once at the house, silent and waiting. She knew the knock would come again one day. But now she was ready, because she was the keeper, and the door was hers to guard.